Welcome to Season 5 of the Willing Equine podcast, the podcast all about creating positive relationships between horses and people. I'm your host, Adele Shaw, a certified equine behavior consultant, horsemanship mentor, and all-around horse lover. Let's talk about riding with positive reinforcement or clicker training. I'm going to use them synonymously here. Clicker training, though, specifically refers to the use of the tool, the clicker, which is a marker that indicates, okay, that was the right behavior, and then also cues the horse what to do to receive the reinforcement. So for me, I train my horses when they hear the click to come to a stop, stand in a neutral, relaxed position, and then I bring them the food to their mouth. That's what the clicker means as a cue. The clicker also, though, as I said, is an indicator, okay, that they've earned the reinforcement, right? That they met the criteria for that behavior, click, and it bridges that gap between the correct behavior and the arrival of the reinforcement, which ultimately reinforces everything, right? It reinforces everything from the point that you last gave them food to when they were chewing on the food and then they started offering behavior again. And with horses, they are offering behavior while they are chewing. So it's really from the point that like your hand drops away from their mouth or they start to lift their head out of the bucket, they can still be chewing. So from that point, everything that happens until they receive reinforcement again, so the food goes into their mouth, so that point is reinforced, including what happens after the click and all of the stuff that you weren't looking for. So people get in trouble with this, and I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but people get in trouble with this because they wait and they wait and they wait for a desired behavior. So they're like, the horse is moving their head around, they're moving around, they're dancing around, and then they finally stand still, and then they get the click, and then the horse comes to their pouch, and then they take their hand away from their pouch and feed them far away from their body. But what just happened actually is that we reinforced all of the dancing around, the movement, etc., and also the standing still for that brief second, and also the putting their head into the pouch, and also the moving the head away from the pouch. That all got looped in. This is when we talk about clean loops and building criteria that you want, and then shrinking your loop, going back to a place where you're only getting desired behaviors between reinforcement and reinforcement. This is what we're talking about. You can't, and then also this is also associated with when we talk about not withholding food, and then errorless learning and good training. Like, this is all part of that whole idea there. So keep that in mind, that clicker training is specifically about the use of the tool, the clicker, and what that means and its timing and all that. But some people do use clicker training in a way that is not predominantly positive reinforcement based. It is just a tool. It would be like saying, and actually I'm not a huge fan of saying things are clicker, like I'm a clicker trainer. I mean, technically I am, but that's like saying somebody's a spur trainer or a whip trainer or a bit trainer, or I'm trying to think of another tool that a lunge line trainer, or, it's all about how it's being used, right? So I've seen people use clickers when they are with negative reinforcement. So they are using the clicker in the same timing as the release. So they would apply some pressure, and then the release happens and they click at that point. Sometimes without food. I've actually seen this happen, like no positive reinforcement. It's just the use of the clicker to increase precision in the timing of the release of pressure. I've also seen people do that same thing, but then click and then give food afterwards as well. So it's like negative reinforcement. We call this negative reinforcement with the cherry on top. And I've actually talked about this on my other social media platforms, but really what this comes down to is that we're training with negative reinforcement predominantly. And then we're adding food into the equation in a more classical conditioning capacity, meaning that we are bringing something pleasant into the experience to help improve the horse's association with what's happening. So we're adding the cherry on top. We're making it just a little bit better. So it's more about conditioning and creating associations than it is about positive reinforcement. So it's not combined reinforcement. I have issues with that term. It's negative reinforcement with the addition of something pleasant to the equation to build more positive associations, pleasant associations with the experience, which I have no problem with. I don't train that way. I don't teach people to train that way because I see a lot of room for potential errors and issues for the horse, and some conflicted feelings and emotions, and also misunderstandings from the trainer's perspective, meaning they get into this idea that we're using both positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Like, we see a lot of misinformation floating around about this. I also see problems with poisoning cues, creating conflict, just all kinds of stuff with this kind of approach. So that's why I personally don't train that way, but there are people who do it quite well and have really good results, and the horses seem quite happy. So I'm not like poo-pooing on it. I just want everybody to be honest and transparent about what is actually happening. So it's not good or bad. I'm not trying to project like an ethical, like this is wrong, this is right. I'm not talking about that. We're just talking about the science. We're just talking about what is reality and what's not, and some of these misused terms or misunderstandings that happen, the misinformation that goes around about this kind of training. All right, so now back to the original topic, which was about riding, but I just wanted to get that, clarified pretty quickly. There's a difference between training with positive reinforcement, and we need to be very careful and mindful of when somebody says that they're clicker training riding, what are they using? Positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement with the cherry on top, or just negative reinforcement? Clicker is just a tool. Okay, so we've gotten that out of the way. I am specifically going to be talking about training riding with positive reinforcement, and I'm actually going to be answering some questions that I got on social media on my Instagram about riding, and some questions people have about riding with positive reinforcement, some of their concerns. And so we're going to be talking about that, and we'll dive into more of what this process looks like, what's realistic, what can you expect, what is achievable with positive reinforcement under saddle, and just everything having to do with riding. So we'll start with talking about the process of introducing riding with positive reinforcement, and a really common confusion point, which is, can we ride without pressure? Specifically, people are referring to pressure and release, which is negative reinforcement, and the answer is yes. However, what gets confusing is that sometimes, and a lot of times actually, we can train tactile cues with positive reinforcement. Not all tactile cues, not all contact with the horse physically is pressure and release, is negative reinforcement. And going forward, I'm going to be talking about I'm going to be using the word pressure and release, and just recognize that means I'm talking about negative reinforcement. I'll kind of use them interchangeably, but pressure and release, negative reinforcement, same thing. Also, if you're reading this stuff online or whatever, it's R with the negative sign afterwards, that's negative reinforcement. Again, negative reinforcement, and I've talked about this many other times, negative reinforcement doesn't mean bad reinforcement, just as positive reinforcement doesn't mean good reinforcement. Positive reinforcement means the application of an appetitive, something that is desirable following behavior, to encourage more of that behavior, okay? Negative reinforcement means the application of an aversive, something that is unpleasant, even mildly so, and then the release of that thing, the removal of that thing, that's the negative, the removal, the subtraction of it, is the reinforcer that encourages more of that behavior. So you squeeze a little with your legs, the horse takes a step forward, you take the leg pressure off, that reinforces that behavior. This is why timing of the release of the pressure is so critical, because that's the reinforcer. It's no different than when we talk about the timing of the application of the appetitive. So food, scratches, whatever your horse likes, is so critical with reinforcing the desired behaviors with positive reinforcement. And this is where clicker training comes into the equation, because it's a little bit hard to feed our horse mid-trot, right? We're like trotting along, and they're like, oh, we like that spot of the trot. You can't just reach down and feed your horse. Somebody'd probably get hurt. So we have they created and invented the tool of the clicker and did all the science and the research behind it that helped. And then we created this. We didn't really create it. We just discovered it. The ability for the learner to pair the sound, the arrival of the marker. So it could be even a tap on the shoulder for like deaf horses. It could be a light flashing also for deaf horses. But for most commonly it's a sound. So like a clicker, like an actual mechanical clicker. And I don't have one with me. I was going to make the sound, but then also we could use like a tongue click. That's the sound that I make. Some people will use the word like good or good boy or good girl or yes or whatever. The problem with words is that, and again, I talk about this a lot on other episodes, but they change. So like if I have a sore throat today, yes, versus yes, versus yes, versus yes, or yes. Like those are all, they sound so different. And even as I'm recording this podcast, my inflection is changing, my tonality, everything is changing, the volume is changing, and it's actually really hard for us to be just monotone. And additionally, we talk a lot. We talk a lot as a species, and then we're like talking, and then we're like, good girl, talk, good girl, talk, good girl. Like, how is the horse supposed to be able to identify those words, especially if you use those words in other contexts? So like I might be talking, oh, good job to my son, right? I just said good. Is that a bridge? So confusing, right? So what happens is the horse often stops identifying those words as a bridge signal, as a marker, and starts paying attention to something else. Oftentimes I find that it's reaching into the pouch, and then people are like, my horse is so, mouthy and on top of my hands and like in my pouch and all that. I'm like, and part of that is because there's not a good, well-established marker signal. So this is why we like to use things that are really unique, that stand out, that we don't use in any other context. I mean, I have 3 kids and I have clickers. I have like 30,000 of them, but they're all the same. I use the same brand, the same style, everything of the clickers. And that way it's really uniform. And then I don't let my children touch any of those clickers. They never go off unless it's for the reason of marking something and then reinforcing it. Now, horses can learn when the click is for them and it's for a different horse. That's a whole nother topic. But this is where the tool of the clicker came in, because we need good timing to be able to reinforce the desired behavior and then follow it with the reinforcer. And in the case of positive reinforcement, it's often food or scratches, because that's what horses like. We like to hope that they might just want to be petted or that they like our company or whatever, but we don't get to decide what is reinforcing. The horse does. And for a lot of living species, all living species, food is a primary reinforcer. And so it is a very powerful tool, and it is a very powerful reinforcer, and is one that is almost uniform across every species. It's just you have to find the type of food and in what quantity and what delivery style, etc., that works for that species. So this is why food is so common. It's also really easy to carry around. It's easy to hand to somebody else and duplicate. And not every horse likes to have scratches or pets. Actually, I know quite a few where people are like, oh, he loves scratches. And I'm watching that horse's behavior and their expression. They're like, I'm tolerating this. I don't really love it. So it's not going to be an effective reinforcer for that behavior if the horse doesn't really enjoy it and they want to perform that behavior again to receive that reinforcer. That's what drives positive reinforcement, right? They have to want that reinforcer. Okay, so going back to riding with positive reinforcement, the timing of the reinforcer is critical. Then we're also going to bring back in this idea of the loops, right? So everything between reinforcer and reinforcer gets reinforced. So when we're training under saddle work with positive reinforcement, it's not any different than working on the ground. On the ground, I might start with a horse I've never worked with before, like let's teach them to lead. So they're going to be standing there, not doing anything because we haven't started the session. I start the session, I give them some reinforcer. Again, this horse is complete novice, complete green horse. I've never worked with this horse before. And I'm going to be crashing through this because this is going to take time to build, but let's just roll with it. So the horse is going to bring their head up. I'm going to click and reinforce that, and I'm going to first start by teaching this horse to stand with me, because that's the most critical behavior that you should ever teach a horse with positive reinforcement, is to stand with you quietly. Because unlike with negative reinforcement, positive reinforcement doesn't inherently teach a lack of behavior. Like negative reinforcement, pressure and release, often unintentionally teaches horses, or maybe intentionally, but it teaches horses to wait to have that pressure applied to then know how to get the reinforcer. So it kind of gets built in. The horse starts, I don't want to use the words, they just learn to stand there. They just learn like, okay, I don't do anything until I get that initial level of pressure. It could be so mild. It could just be looking at your horse. It could be wiggling a finger, okay? The initial level of pressure that gives them the information as to what to do to get the reinforcer. With positive reinforcement, that's not inherent, that standing still. And then also with pressure and release, oftentimes we don't even realize, but we're incorporating quite a bit of positive punishment. So a applying an aversive to decrease the behavior. So the horse starts to move, and then you apply an aversive, again, even a mild one, like backing the horse up gently, or letting him, like sending him in a circle and then asking him to stop again. Like you applied an aversive after the horse performed a behavior other than standing still. And then so that we start to decrease the frequency, we decrease the occurrence of that behavior because they're avoiding that consequence, right? So, on the flip side of things, positive reinforcement often we can accidentally apply a lot of negative punishment, which is the removal of something appetitive as a punisher. That's a whole nother conversation. I've talked a lot about it though, on this podcast and in other places, but this is where that withholding the reinforcer, actually that previous example that I gave, where the person is just waiting until the horse does a desired behavior. That kind of falls into that. We're withholding, we're keeping the appetitive, we're keeping it from the horse until we see something we like. But on the flip side of that, what can happen is, or in the same line of thinking, say you've been clicking and feeding your horse for standing still, and all of a sudden they start moving around and you stop feeding, right? We can very quickly move into a negative punishment. Now we're withholding that reinforcer as a punisher for moving around. A more clear example of this, though, would be like your horse starts getting mouthy and pushy and just kind of dangerous to be around, and you just exit the training area and take the food with you. I see this sometimes, and I see it actually accidentally being applied at the end of a session. So we've done this whole beautiful training session, and then we're like, oh, that was so fantastic. Here, we're all done. Like, we're great. Now you get a big break. We're thinking it's a break, but actually what we just did when we exited the area and took the food with us or stopped giving them food is we punished whatever came last. So positive reinforcement is just working on an entirely different wavelength than, just kind of that communication, that dialogue that is happening between you and the horse. It looks and feels so very different than with pressure and release, negative reinforcement. So we have to be very careful to educate ourselves and work with coaches and mentors and whoever, and to be able to understand these nuances, these differences. It's not just about giving the food. It's not just about adding in a tool like the clicker. It's so much more involved than that. I'm not going to say it's overly like everybody could learn it. You could self-teach yourself. You could be self-taught and learn how to do positive reinforcement. I was largely self-taught to begin with. I made a tremendous amount of mistakes. It would have definitely been beneficial to have a coach. That it just wasn't as available to me at the time. There was no courses, none of that. So, but it's really important to understand that they are at a core level, at a fundamental level. Working with positive reinforcement, training horse with positive reinforcement is very different than training something with negative reinforcement. How the horse perceives it, how we perceive it, how the interaction is going, what is reinforced, and what reinforcement looks like, and what punishment looks like, etc. It can be so different. So it's really important for you to understand these differences before you start trying to train with positive reinforcement under saddle. Okay, so going back to the idea of the loops. So everything between reinforcement and reinforcement is reinforced. And also we don't have this inherent built-in, like we just stand still, right? So I have this horse back in this example that I totally bunny trailed off of, I'm just going to teach them to stand still first. Once I get a little bit of that, some duration of that, I'm going to start introducing the idea of walking with me. Okay, so I am going to use something like a target stick. I'm going to teach them to look at this target stick, click feed. I present the target stick again. They look at it, click feed, present the target stick again. They look at it, click feed. Okay, now I'm going to present the target stick just a little bit ahead of them. They take a step forward. As they're taking the step forward, I click feed, and we're going to build until I can present this target and start walking with the horse for extended periods. Click, everybody comes to a stop. Then I feed my horse. There's a whole bunch of nuance in here that I'm not going to dive into, like introducing the walk on cue so that you can fade out the target, making sure that everybody comes to a stop after the click before you reach for your food. There's a bunch of stuff that I teach in my courses that we're just not going to have time to cover today, and it requires coaching. But there's a lot of nuance here, and I'm just kind of crashing through this. Okay. So I've taught this horse to follow the target. Now I'm going to fade out this target. So now the horse is just walking with me, click feed, and I have it on cue. So I've given the walk on cue. The horse knows, oh, okay, we walk. We're going to walk together. The click, everybody comes to a stop, food. Okay, great. Now I want to be able to do more than walk just 10 steps. I want to be able to turn left. I want to be able to turn right. I want to be able to cue the halt, then the backup, then the halt again, then click and feed. Absolutely, we can do that. We teach each of those things individually, it kind of in an isolated way. With the turning left and right, we have to have some movement first. That's why it comes later. But so we cue the horse to walk on, and we use our target to guide them to the left, click feed. Then we use, work on the right turn, click feed, and we put each of those on cue. Now we can say, okay, the left turn is on cue and highly reinforced. The right turn is on cue and highly reinforced. The walking forward is on cue and highly reinforced. Okay, now we're going to work on the halting, and we've got that on cue, highly reinforced. Okay, great. Now we're going to train the backup. Okay, we got that on cue, highly reinforced. Excellent. Okay, great. Now we're going to start to put these together. I'm going to cue the walk on. I'm going to cue a left turn, click feed. Then we're going to go to this again, walk on, turn left, now turn right, click feed. And you see how we're going to go? We're going to keep adding and making this sequence, or, we're just going to keep adding. We're going to keep adding until we're getting more and more and more behavior between the reinforcement. So actually this is now a really big loop. Initially, the loop looked like, can you just stand with me? And it was very high rate of reinforcement. We're just clicking and feeding, clicking and feeding, clicking and feeding, because we're only trying to get desired behaviors in this loop. And often I'm using protected contact in the beginning because I got to start where the horse can be successful and then build. So we're stretching and stretching and stretching and stretching this loop until before we know it, we can ask the horse to walk on, we can do some trotting, now we can turn left, now we can turn right, now we can halt, now that we can go back to the walk, now we can go over to this ground pole, now we can halt, click feed, right? And we can build this up to doing whole jump patterns, doing barrel racing patterns, doing dressage under saddle, doing pretty much, most of the riding stuff we do, not everything, but most riding stuff could be trained with positive reinforcement. The thing is that we don't have enough years yet in the positive reinforcement community to have a large pool of examples to draw from to show, like, okay, here's a horse that knows a whole dressage pattern. Here's a horse that knows a full jump pattern. And definitely not in the show environments yet. It's such a new way of working with horses that we just don't have a tremendous amount of examples yet, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. Additionally, here's the other thing that I'll say. A lot of people who train with positive reinforcement right now are coming to positive reinforcement because they've been having problems with their horse trained in traditional training. Often this means that we're working through trauma, we're working through really severe negative associations, we're working through physical issues, we're working through rebuilding that trust and relationship. And so we're not starting with a clean slate. We're not, which is a little bit of a misnomer, but anyway, the idea of a clean slate, right? We don't have a lot of examples of horses coming into positive reinforcement without all of the baggage, and then working with really skilled trainers. So that's the other part of this, is that, we've got novice handlers, which is perfectly fine. No problem with that. With horses that have a lot of baggage, and then they are learning together and they are making tremendous strides, but they're not probably going to make it to the Olympics. And that's okay. It is okay. And I love that. I love that they are focusing on the relationship. They're relearning, they're learning together. The skills that trainer is going to learn working with that horse is going to be invaluable, and they will be able to take that into working with other horses. Additionally, horses that have been trained with negative reinforcement initially and then are introduced to positive reinforcement, the process is typically slower because, linking back to, they wait to be prompted with pressure to do a behavior for fear of correction, or just because it's like a natural kind of side effect of working with predominantly negative reinforcement. It takes longer for them to learn initially. It does get better with time and experience. They get faster and they get more eager and more trusting, and they're quicker to pick up on stuff. But there's a big difference between young horses that work with skilled trainers from the very, very beginning with positive reinforcement and have never experienced much, if any, negative reinforcement in a structured training session. Their ability to pick up on things and learn things is exponentially faster. Like, they just bam, 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 where they're ready to go, like lightning fast, and it's so easy. I've had so many of my students come to me when they have a new younger horse after they're more experienced. I always encourage people to wait to start a young horse with positive reinforcement until they have more experience working with what we call crossover horses with positive reinforcement. Because with the crossover horses, you at least have that common language, that common experience with negative reinforcement. So if something's going wrong, you can always go back to that. And you have a baseline that you guys can start from that is more common. When working with young horses that don't have any negative reinforcement training and only positive reinforcement training, sometimes there's a lot of challenges that can come with it if you are not a skilled trainer yet with positive reinforcement specifically. Because there's a lot of people who are excellent trainers with negative reinforcement, but very little experience with positive reinforcement. So I'm specifically talking about experienced trainers with positive reinforcement. Okay, so a lot of my students will come to me and they'll be like, I don't know if it's just like genetics are different or the horse is different or if it's a me thing or whatever, but working with this horse and like every horse that comes after that, after their first one or two, is so much easier. Things are going so much faster. And then they especially say this if it's a young horse with no, real background. And one, it's because they're more experienced. And then two, it's because we're not working through a lot of trauma, a lot of baggage. And so there's just a big difference. So this goes back to why we're not seeing a lot of examples in the performance horse world yet of horses trained with positive reinforcement. We're still learning as trainers. There's not a lot of really experienced trainers yet. It didn't become more recognized and mainstream until, it's not even mainstream yet, but just more recognized until very, very recently, like the last couple of years, to be honest. It's been around for a long time. We didn't invent this stuff. It's been in the zoo world for a very long time. It's been in the dog world for a very long time. It's even been in the horse world for quite some time. But it's not become more popular, or at least most people didn't even know what it was until the last couple of years. And then we get a little bit of it's not a very accurate interpretation of what's happening out in the real world through Instagram. So if we just look at Instagram makes it look like everybody knows what positive reinforcement is, or has at least been exposed to it, and that most people incorporate it to some extent, or at least there's tons of progress in the horse world happening. That is not the case out in the real world. Like it's there's a little bit of a bubble happening on social media. There's a little, especially on Instagram. So the community is evolving, the training is evolving. We don't have enough examples yet, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. The science is there. The training ability is there. The horses can do it. Here is the caveat to that though. A lot of our performances, our competitions, the disciplines that we ride do rely on a very strong flight response. So we got flight, fright, freeze, right? And fawn, we could even add that in there. A lot of them rely on a flight response, meaning the horse running fast to avoid something. And I'm not saying, don't take that and be like Adele said that, horse racing is abusive. I didn't say that. That's a whole different conversation. But the way those horses are trained, and it's just science, they are running from something. They are not running to something. No matter how much we want to say that they are not. They're running from pressure. And we rely on the core principle of the use of negative reinforcement for a lot of these high-speed competitions. Also, additionally, most competitions, most organizations, and the way they're set up and the way the patterns are run and the way that the show is set up and everything are biased towards the use of negative reinforcement and are not set up for the use of positive reinforcement. Even organizations with the Liberty stuff, all that, they are still biased towards the use of negative reinforcement. You can take a whip into the arena, which I know of people, extension of the arm. Okay. But they're in the actual pattern itself, the Liberty pattern, they are constantly pressure release, pressure release, pressure release. It's mild forms of it. It's subtle. You're not fully stopping and taking the pressure off, ending the whole pattern. But there is a constant use of release as reinforcement, constant throughout the whole pattern. It's just happening constantly. However, we are not allowed to use positive reinforcement in this pattern. That doesn't mean we can't train the horse to do the whole pattern and then receive the reinforcement at the very end. That is possible in theory. However, it is a very long, like that would take a tremendous amount of training and take a lot of skill. And also is not every horse will be able to do that, to go and do so much behavior before receiving some reinforcement. There's a bit of this idea that in these show patterns, and I'm just going to continue to use the Liberty patterns as an example, because I think a lot of people view Liberty training and positive reinforcement in the same category, but they are not necessarily. So a lot of people look at this Liberty pattern and they're not seeing the reinforcement. They're not seeing the constant little application of pressure, little removal of it, little application of pressure, little removal of pressure, and that release happening. They're not seeing this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Yet if we were to come in and do that same pattern and have the same rate of reinforcement with positive reinforcement, it would be very, very obvious because we stop and give food. That would break the flow of the pattern. I get it, and maybe not look as pretty. I think it's as pretty, but it's very much a perception thing. We perceive the use of pressure and release and that constant, that is being more pretty, more fluid, more natural. Like there's all of these ideas and a lot of projection and constructs that are thrown onto the use of negative reinforcement that people struggle to transfer over to use of positive reinforcement. But if we look at just the science itself and the application of the reinforcers and how often the reinforcers are being applied, it's not any different. It's not any different. How I train something with negative reinforcement is going to involve the same process of the loops, the starting off small with thin slicing our criteria, starting where the horse can be successful. We're just going to apply a little bit of pressure and ask for one step forward and then release. Okay, now we're going to work up to, and this is many, many repetitions of the one step, and then we go up in every level that I mentioned. Like when I say we're going to add, the previous one got like 5 to 10 reps before we add more. Okay, so now we're going to go up to like 2 steps. So we add a little pressure, they take 2 steps, we release, right? And this is just built systematically and in loops, and the reinforcement is happening, and it's happening at the same rate. It just looks different than when somebody has to reach into their pouch and get food and feed them. And that's where we keep running into the perception that positive reinforcement isn't practical for under saddle work and that it doesn't seem like it would work because we have to stop and feed them all the time. If you're a good trainer and you do your homework and you practice, you will not have to reinforce under saddle work with positive reinforcement any more than you would with negative reinforcement. That's what it comes down to. It's the same level of reinforcement. Actually, I did a trail ride the other day with one of my horses, and I was tracking it, and I'm using one of those apps that like tracks when your horse is halted, walking, trotting, or cantering, and it tracked every time I did a transition from a walk or trot to a halt, which is when I would reinforce, and it was super interesting. I don't remember what it was, but it was a really cool because I could see the duration, and I could average how often I was having to, the frequency of the rate of my reinforcement basically over, I think it was like a mile-long trail ride. And it was very interesting because now I'm going to be able to keep data and I won't have to track it in my head constantly, but I'll be able to see the rate of reinforcement happening throughout, per mile kind of thing. And we could do the same thing with negative reinforcement too if we tracked the rate of reinforcement. Anyway, it's an interesting idea, and I get nerdy about these things and I think about them. But okay, so now we're going to move on to answering some of the questions that people have about riding with positive reinforcement. Okay. Our first question is, I'm wondering how positive reinforcement trained riding behaviors transfer to using negative reinforcement, and what might that mean for horses who are trained, in quotes, only with positive reinforcement, but are going to be sold into traditional homes? Really good question. So if you've trained the behaviors with positive reinforcement to quite the level where the reinforcement is infrequent, and you've done a really good job, you've set your horse up for success, they have really well established under saddle behaviors, meaning and you can make all of your cues look identical to negative reinforcement cues, tactile cues, right? But they're not pressure and release. So on the ground, I'm going to teach the horse to walk on when I say walk on. Okay, so that's going to be the cue from the ground. Then I'm going to transfer it to under saddle. But I don't want the walk-on cue to be, I don't want to have to say walk-on every single time. I want to be able to give a tactile cue so it looks just like traditionally trained riding behaviors, especially if I'm going to enter a show or whatever and I can't talk. And also because it's likely that somebody will try and ride this horse and give that tactile cue. It's a very common one, and I want the horse to be prepared. Okay, so we're going to use a new cue, old cue. So I'm going to say walk-on, and then, take that back. I'm going to give the tactile cue briefly, lightly, and then I'm going to follow it with walk on, and then the horse starts to walk on, click reinforcement. I'm going to do it again and again and again and again and again until I can touch the horse's sides with my leg and the horse starts to move, click feed. So no walk on was needed, no words walk on were needed. And then we're going to repeat, repeat, repeat. Now the horse understands, oh, she touches my side. It means the same thing as walk on, and I still get the click and reinforcement. So we have transferred the cue to a tactile cue. So if you have a horse that you believe that will change ownership to somebody who's going to ride with negative reinforcement, it would be very, very beneficial to teach this horse negative reinforcement alike cues. Then also being very intentional with adding criteria and long duration behaviors and putting behaviors on variable reinforcement schedules, meaning that it only periodically gets reinforced, or it just gets, it's just a variable interval. It's not always 3 steps and then click and reinforcement. It's 4 steps sometimes, then it's 10 steps the other time, and then it's 3 steps, and then it's 20 steps. Like eventually, not right away, we work up to this. And or it's walk on, turn left, turn right, stop, walk on, click feed. And then the next time it's walk on, turn right, back up, then walk on, then go left, click feed. So like you're mixing up that pattern, right? That would be an option as well. So making sure that your horse has very long duration behaviors that are trained to, excellence, and that you have trained your cues to look like negative reinforcement cues. That would likely be the best approach for this. However, I will say, if the future home stops giving positive reinforcement for the behavior altogether, the behaviors will deteriorate because you've removed the reinforcer. Just like they would if you stopped releasing. If you only applied pressure, and you never released, or your timing was unpredictable or whatever, you would get a horse that stopped responding. This is exactly what happens to those lesson ponies that are so dull and, I'm using labels, but are just really difficult to ride, right? They need retuning in quotation marks because they're being ridden by trainers, by kids who are inexperienced. They just pressure. The release timing is terrible. They may never release, etc. And so they become dull. They just kind of shut down. They're just like, nope, nothing works. I don't ever get reinforcement for this. I just have to, whatever. Same thing would happen with positive reinforcement. However, there's the possibility that the reinforcer could be transferred to a release of pressure, because I can do this the other way around, where I have horses that are trained with negative reinforcement that I change into positive reinforcement without starting from scratch. I just start giving the positive reinforcement after. So I give the cue, which was trained with negative reinforcement. So like touching the legs to the side, they take a step forward, click feed. Same, repeat. And the horse can start to, at this stage, it's still negative reinforcement cue, and potentially the horse is looking for that release, and so it's still being maintained by negative reinforcement, but I'm introducing the positive reinforcement. So we've got a negative reinforcement with the cherry on top. However, what happens, and this is where I try and get to, is one day the horse will feel the leg thing on the legs on the side, and then they won't go forward, and I don't add any more pressure. I don't even hold pressure. We don't do anything. But, there's just no increase of pressure, none of that. And then the horse, there's this moment where the horse goes, oh, this is different. And then it depends on the situation, but I'll reset them back up for success. I might cue them one more time. And then when they do it the second time, click reinforcement. Like there's a lot of different things that go into that, but we can, in theory, although I can never guarantee it, transfer things from negative reinforcement to positive reinforcement. If there isn't a lot of fear associated, a lot of baggage, etc., a lot of times this can be effective. And in theory, we can also do it the other way too. I will say there's just not a lot of data on this because we don't have a lot of experience of horses with positive reinforcement going to negative reinforcement homes. Oftentimes it's the other way around. And also people with horses trained with positive reinforcement typically want to sell to a positive reinforcement home or rehome to a positive reinforcement home. So I don't know that we have clean data on this, but those would be my recommendations for helping a horse that might eventually go to a traditional home. And eventually horses know what negative reinforcement is. They are all born understanding positive reinforcement, negative punishment, positive punishment. It is inherent. It is just part of learning. What they don't inherently know is the cues. That's what happens through the training process to access the reinforcer. So what can happen here is if you've trained those cues for those behaviors to look just like a traditional one, the horse should be able to fairly seamlessly figure out that the reinforcer has just changed for the same cue. But you may get some frustration in between. You may get some reluctance, and then it will switch, and then the horse will start to figure out that things have changed. But I don't know that I would encourage, I think that this would be a difficult transition for the horse, and I don't know again, we just don't have a lot of data on this. I don't have a lot of all my horses go to a positive reinforcement home. If I don't usually rehome, but when I have clients' horses that come to me that are trained with positive reinforcement, they go back and keep learning with positive reinforcement. All my horses have traditionally trained or traditionally looking cues, but they're trained with positive reinforcement. And I don't have any problem teaching people who have traditional riding cues to ride my positive reinforcement horses. I just tell them, hey, when you would normally take off the pressure, or when you would normally, you're just going to switch it to click and food rather than releasing that pressure. So if your horse does what you ask him to do after a certain amount of time, give him the click and the food rather than just thinking that rest is the reinforcer or the break is the reinforcer. So it's not too hard to teach people to switch that over. So if you know who the horse is going to, their home, all that, you could teach that person how to continue to use a light form of positive reinforcement to maintain those behaviors pretty easily if the horse has that training. Okay, next question. Do I use it to train only, or do I have to keep doing it all the time even when my horse learns? So as we've talked about through this whole episode, the reinforcement has to continue to maintain the behavior. If you stop providing reinforcement for the behavior will stop happening. All behaviors are maintained for some reason. They all have a function. They all get something. Your horse walks up to the water trough, let's say there's two water troughs. There's water trough A, water trough B. You have both of them full all the time to begin with. The horse walks up to water trough A, gets the water, reinforced for that action of going towards the water trough by getting water. They go to water trough B, same thing happens. Eventually, though, you stop putting water in water trough B. The horse goes up to the water trough, there's no water, so they don't get the reinforcement. They go over to water trough A, get water, they're reinforced for that. They might try it again. They might try and go to water trough B another time, maybe even 2 or 3 more times, and there's no water, so no reinforcement. They go to water trough A, they get the reinforcement. Guess what they're going to start doing? Only going to water trough A because it's the only one that gives them reinforcement. The behavior of going to water trough B has stopped. Same thing happens with negative reinforcement. If you stopped applying or giving release of pressure, then the behavior, they're going to stop. They stop responding. They're like, well, nothing gets the release. This is when we get shut down horses. This is when we get horses that just are dull and are non-responsive. You have to give the reinforcement. Reinforcement drives the behavior. Same thing with positive reinforcement. So you still have to continue to provide the positive reinforcement if you've trained it with positive reinforcement, and that is the reinforcer that the horse is looking for, or else the behavior will stop. Okay, follow up to that last question. Because my horse can be really focused on food and not the task, and when I stop giving treats, he just goes back to being lazy and refuses to do anything. That's because your reinforcer stopped. And also it sounds like there is a lack of reinforcing aspect for the negative reinforcement, and potentially also the horse is not enjoying what you're doing with negative reinforcement. Could be a physical issue, could just be that it's just not something the horse is interested in. I don't know that horses enjoy, this is what I love about positive reinforcement, and it gives something back to the horse. The horse now can start to enjoy these things that we enjoy too, because there's something in it for them. It's not just a constant aversive, release of aversive, aversive, a release of aversive, aversive, release of aversive. That just sounds not fun. However, with positive reinforcement, it's behavior, good thing, behavior, good thing, behavior, good thing. And so there's something in it for them that makes it good. And we incorporate classical conditioning, which is that the development of the associations, right? So we're pairing something good with this thing that we're doing, and this constant pairing that is happening because we're using lots of food during our training sessions is creating good associations with the training. So the training becomes positive. It becomes pleasant for them because they want to do it because there's something in it for them that they enjoy. So we got classical conditioning on board as well. All right, guys, this is a good place to wrap up this episode. There's so much more to discuss when it comes to riding with positive reinforcement, which is why I have a full course on starting horses under saddle or restarting horses under saddle with positive reinforcement. You can find out more information about that on my website. Until then, though, if you have more questions, you can always message me through the podcast platform. You can also message me through Instagram, Facebook, or you can email me as well, info@thewillingequine.com. Thanks so much for listening. If you have any questions, please do email me at info@thewillingequine.com. If you'd like more information on my courses, coaching, consulting, or even access to free resources, please do check out my website, thewillingequine.com. If you like this podcast or this episode, please do leave feedback on the platform that you listen to it on.